Well, you guys will look depressed because you guys mortgage your future to get there,
I
right? Like if you don't win, it might be one and done. I mean, because you got so many free agents and all that kind of stuff. We have like younger players, like first and second year players, so we got some time. Although there's no guarantee, right? I mean, it's like once you get there, you might be Dan Marino, right?
yeah.
Get there once and never get there again, even though you're a great player. I mean, football is humbling like that.
But if you were going to do that, wouldn't you want to inspire like a high quality film like Ace Ventura Pet Detective?
Okay.
Where
Yeah, let me just go with that. Yes.
wasn't that the guy that held the uh held the laces out or whatever, and has like a breakdown. I can't remember how it worked, but in Ace Ventura Pet Detective, it was like the person that held the kicks for the kicker or something loses it. I don't remember, uh, but it was connected to the loss of the Dolphins.
Oh, you're gonna be surprised. That's not on my canonical list right there.
You,
That
Ace
particular
Ventura
movie.
Pet Detective. I mean,
Yeah, it's just somehow that didn't make the canon for me. So I don't
oh
know.
well.
That's like that's like secondary literature. So I have to look.
I, I hope you survive.
I don't have that like an immediate recall right now.
It has this scene in it that I used last time I taught ethics, um, where I was talking about social acceleration, how
Hmm.
um, there are lots of elements of our culture that accelerate, but one of them is even what what is and isn't allowable in the public square. And there's a scene in it that's so obscene that if you grew up with it, you're laughing, but it's just horrible
Uh,
jokes
okay.
around gender and sexuality.
Really?
That, yeah, and I mean, I didn't think about it, when I was watching it, and I'm like, I bet I laughed really hard at this at some point. And
Mm-hmm.
but the
I think you just
uh
described the whole '90s for a lot of people.
yeah, yeah. But it's one of those like you can pull it up and you remember if you were uh you know if you were a Jim Carrey fan,
uh, uh,
going like, I remember this movie, oh, that was a really funny scene, and then you're like listening back to it and you're like, oh, my bad. um anyway,
right,
people are
right.
jumping on now.
Okay. Oh, let me switch something. Give me
Oh,
30 seconds.
you can have 45, Adam.
Great.
Hello, Fred and Jay and Michael and Laura and Peter and Mary Thomas. If you have your middle name Mary Thomas Watts in there, is that because most people call you Mary Thomas? I say that as a father of Cora Lane Fuller, and I am a regular advocate that it's not just Cora, it's Cora Lane. Not just because it occasionally leads to Cora Lane, she's in my, Penny Lane, but yes, exactly. Cora Lane. Mary, it is a Southern thing. There are some names where the middle name gets added to signal the judgment you're about to receive from parental unit or a grandparent. Like they're going like Tripp, but they go to my full name, George Hiram Fuller the Third, and I'm like, oh, junk. I don't know what I'm going to apologize for, but it's about to happen. Adam.
All right. I just heard a tremendous name. Like, what was that?
Oh, well, people. Hi, Richard. Well, or Dick. Uh, I was looking at everyone that had already commented, and then we have Mary Thomas Watts, and so I was asking if she uses Mary Thomas regularly,
Hmm.
and that's why the middle name's in it, or not. She said yes, it's a Southern thing, and that's why uh, our middle child Cora, when we were in North Carolina, was Cora Lane. People called her Cora Lane because her middle name
Oh,
was Lane. But here it's Cora because they have a weird R.
right. See,
And in
I would
California,
think
it's just Cora.
I would think Cora is such a unique name that she would be one of one, right? Like I wouldn't think there's another Cora in the classroom,
No, there we have not had that yet. Though I
right?
have heard like on the ranking of popular names, he
Mhm.
got more popular. Elgin,
Really?
on the other hand, our oldest, has not gotten more popular. He's just still
Mm.
kicking it as a unique name.
Right.
Uh, it hadn't been popular since the 1920s. So
You mean E Fresh?
yeah, I call him E Biscuit,
E
E Money.
Biscuit.
Uh, he's he's very into all my nicknames for him. Can't you just call me Elgin?
Right, right. Just plain old Elgin, right? What's wrong
My
with that?
so his middle name's Thomas, and when we were, you go through like all the family names, what names you want, blah 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 blah. Well, when we went for Elgin Thomas, immediately in the picking of middle name, I said, if we do Thomas, I can text him once he starts driving, like and he's out. I can just text ET phone home, and
Okay, only you would think of something like that.
I was like, I want to send that text, and the
Uh,
first time it'd be funny to him. He'd be like, I get it. And like the 50th time when he gets it, he'll complain about me to his friends. So that then when he brings him over for dinner, and I'm like, all right, ET, when he says something like, I think is out of this world, in scare quotes, I'm like, all right, ET.
Bad news, man. What's his deal with the Rams and the Bengals now? How is he handling
Oh,
that
Elgin,
existential crisis?
well, he just says he hopes that it's as good as all the playoff games have been, so that
Mm,
when everyone's like it's the greatest NFL playoffs, he's like, yeah, and two of my favorite teams were in the playoffs.
mm.
But Cincinnati has the coolest jerseys, and
Oh, really? Okay.
if you're a 14-year-old, you're just like, that's a tiger on it.
Okay. That's interesting that other people from out, because you don't really see. I mean, the Bengals is not like it has like a big national. It's not like Bengals Nation exists outside of Cincinnati. So,
Yeah,
especially for people who never lived here. So it's interesting to see how a child would. They work hard at that too, the design and imagery. So the fact that it got Elgin is really interesting to me.
we have a Cora Margaret. I was just looking at the comments. Yeah, I'm pumped about the Super Bowl, and I'm really excited about the halftime show.
Oh yeah, that's
It's
right.
like,
Is that
now,
gonna be
Adam,
live? Is that
Adam,
gonna
it's
be
only
live?
6 o'clock for you. You're yawning. You're gonna make me remember it's 11.
Oh man, I've been teaching all day. It takes quite a bit of effort to get here actually on time. That's why I'm always like at the buzzer. It's like
Well,
3, 2, Adam's on. It's-
well, we can hit record. And was there anything you want to say before the part that's permanently saved in the archive of the class?
no, I'm ready. I'm
All right.
ready. I'm ready for this.
Look, that was a very confident.
hmm
All right, everyone. This is Tripp, and I am with my friend Adam for session 4 of Upsetting the Powers Christ from the Underside. And it's timely, not just because we read The Cross and the Lynching Tree, but
Classic.
Cincinnati
Mhm.
is in the Super Bowl.
Hey, Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase. Oh,
Yeah.
there we
Oh
go.
yeah.
We
Yeah. I
go.
hit my buttons.
There you
Um,
go.
so
Who day? Who day? Who day?
so if you don't know or don't remember, Adam is a resident of Cincinnati.
There we
is at
go.
Xavier University, the wonderful place that is always green, lit, bright, and luscious behind him.
There we go.
Uh,
It is a what, eternal object or something.
if if Xavier's an eternal object, it's Joseph Bracken. I really really want to. Joseph Bracken is a Jesuit process theologian who emeritus at Xavier. Anyway, that we can save that for week 6
There we go.
of the class, which I want you all to know how excited we are. Well, why don't you say quickly who it is that's going to be our special guest in week 6?
Well, you introduce you actually like are the connect, and I'm so why don't yeah, why don't you introduce that?
Okay, so we are doing in week 6 one because this is Tripp and Adam's like ongoing personal conversation is our thing about liberation thought, Black theology, process thought in America, one of the dominant streams of liberal theology in America. And so on week 6, we're going to be looking at how Black theology intersects with process thought. Our special guest is Theodore Walker, who is a process theologian, a Black theologian, and has written one of the most powerful texts really connecting the two called Mothership Connections, Black Atlantic Synthesis of Neoclassical Metaphysics and Black Theology.
Mouthful.
Yeah, but it's an academic book. But
Right.
If you go to the resource page, you'll notice the 3 chapters that are in their short chapters, but they're dense. I would put it that way. Not like hard to read, but like the concepts are big. Looking at the metaphysics of struggle, power, and ethics, which are the 3 topics that frame like the kind of questions process thought has around struggle, cosmologically, and then the struggle for liberation. Power, process thought critiques omnipotent power from one. Black theology critiques the notion of power and its siding and internalizing the assumptions of white power. And then ethics, like what does it mean to think about God and the world, community, liberation, and such. When you bring the two, so I say that because he's going to be a special guest. Adam's going to do the interview. We're going to read his stuff. Then we're going to talk about it. I'm excited about it. Center for Process Thought, supporting that, supporting class. But I'm pumped about it. And
Yeah, there hasn't been that many connections between the two, like self-consciously. And actually, for those who may, well, I doubt people know this, but Daniel Day Williams was on faculty with James Cone back in the 70s, who's another kind of towering process thinker. And, the critique about process, as Tripp and I have already discussed, is that they don't engage the political arena sufficiently, right? And the critique against liberationist theology is that they don't sufficiently have a self-conscious metaphysic, right? So someone who is able to weave both of those together and really see how they speak to each other and how they can strengthen each other, not just, have contestatory debates, is very welcoming. And I think it could kind of enhance our project of moving forward. So looking forward to that conversation and really seeing the feedback from that. Monica Coleman does an excellent job also in her book, Making a Way Out of No Way, from a womanist perspective. Theodore Walker does it a bit differently, but we're going to have a great time kind of fleshing that out.
Yeah, definitely. Don in the chat said, then you haven't read John Cobb's Process Theology and Political Theology. I have read it, but I would just say what Adam and I were discussing is, in particular, because of process critique of omnipotence, there have been a large number of Black theologians who have hesitated to engage for certain reasons, and some around eschatology and such. And then even in that book, right, like in process theology and political theology. The main dialogue partner is where political theology emerges in German thought. Johann Baptist Metz, early Jürgen Moltmann. And so there, Cobb's conscious of the fact that that European conversation, namely German post-World War II, occasions for political theology. That was also the same time, right, that and we read this in our readings 2 weeks ago, week 2, that James Cone says it. If you look at the 6 different things that filter in to like the funding Black theology, one of them is like European political theology that started to read to think politically in ways that cultivated suspicion to European assumptions of kind of Eurocentric power and imperialism. But anyway, week 6, we'll pick all that up. But anytime someone gives me a reason to give a shout out to John Cobb, who in 2 weeks turns 97 years old.
Amazing. Yeah. Not like John Cobb too. And I should have meant it to say, Black reality. There hasn't been that many reflections, and not just process, but Whiteheadian process. I mean, there's process inherent in a lot of African thought and everything. So we'll work that out.
Yeah. And see, you can already tell, like half the conversations aren't recorded between Adam and I are this. So we're really excited about it. Okay. Yeah. So today, though, our topic is Christ from the Underside. And we read 2 chapters from Cross and the Lynching Tree. And I know you've mentioned briefly before that this book for Cone was so important because it brought together a lot of themes and parts of his work. I wonder if you want to start by just giving us a framework for thinking about all the streams of his thought that came into this book, and then kind of like how it became, for a lot of people, their first contact with Cone in a broader audience outside the academy. So when we are reading these bits from Crossing the Lynching Tree, and asking the question, the legacy of Cone, what all was going into it and coming out of it?
Yeah, and Cone's really explicit in the preface for people who haven't had a chance to look at that. But what he's trying to do is liberate the cross from its cultural captivity in North America, right? And he's really thinking about the cross in the context of North American Christianity and why it hasn't been able to speak with liberative power effectively. And he says, because it's been so abstract, right? The cross has been used as like an ornament, right? It's like it's like an accessory around people's neck. And in church, it hasn't been giving the kind of depthful kind of reflection. So he says, the reason why that is because it's been abstracted from reality and has to ground with the reality of those who suffer. The lynching tree is a metaphor for those that suffer, right? Black suffering specifically. So the text is this ongoing meditation between trying to see how the cross speaks to the lynching tree and the lynching tree speaks back to the cross, as a way of trying to actually have a fresh statement about the meaning of Christianity in the 21st century, right? And part of it he gets from his understanding of Christian faith, to kind of paraphrase what Niebuhr talked about in his book about beyond tragedy, right? Like Christianity takes us beyond tragedy, right? But the way it takes you from tragedy to victory is through the cross. So the cross is something that takes you, it takes you beyond tragedy by being in and through the cross, right? That's the pathway. So he's a very Christological thinker in talking about the meaning of Christian faith. And the cross and the lynching tree are 2 metaphors that he uses that are essential for the meaning of 21st century Christian faith.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I think that when you say abstraction there, that's something that's really important for us to like pause and go, what is he getting at with abstraction? So when you think of, and this is something right in the second chapter we read, he looks at the way it was the poets of Black life in America who first make the connections, right, between the historical cultural symbol of the cross in the first century and the lynching tree in American existence, and then from there, you see it become a liberative thing in even more of the Black church that had ignored it, let alone the white church that had been running, running a shotgun to imperialist white supremacist Christianity. So one of the things that strikes me both in this work specifically, but also a challenge to theology in general, is what gets covered up with our abstractions.
Yeah, absolutely.
And could you say something about the kind of abstractions that are rampant in American Christianity that Cone just wants to give a frontal assault to? Like, what are the kind of abstractions and how they show up in Christian life that this book is wanting to really just attack and name publicly?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, another word for abstraction is over spiritualization, right? We forget that the Christianity is an incarnational faith, right? Not just, and I think what happens is that with the kind of emphasis on just spirituality in general and a kind of moving away from issues of religion and faith talk, the spiritual becomes a way that people can spiritually bypass the body, the concrete, right? So that people can talk about certain types of spiritual themes without dealing with the concrete forms of embodiment. So the main thing in terms of the abstraction is the abstraction of Black bodies, right? That Christianity and Christian theologians haven't dealt dealing seriously with bodily suffering of Black folk and oppressed folks in the context of this country. So he borrows a phrase from the Gutierrez. He says, we can't think about the death of Jesus without thinking about the death of real people, of the world's poor, right? That we find God in the suffering of the world's poor, and that Christianity has been so deeply complicit with human oppression that the challenge for him is, how do you disarticulate this? How do you disentangle, right? And there's always a reminder that Christianity isn't just about spirituality alone. At the center of Christianity is about an executed God, right? A murdered God, right? That should mean something, right? And how do you organize around a God who's murdered by state power, right? And not see all of these Black bodies who are murdered by state power as an entree into Christian faith, right? And so he's really trying to wake up about how Christianity is repositioned within the context of American culture, and there's been this deep type of misdirection about the significance of Christianity. And this is why a lot of Black theologians, when you talked about the conversation with Cobb and political theology, don't like political theology, right? Why they have the strong critique, because why would you use Schmidt, a Nazi, right? Why would left people use a Nazi, right, to kind of reef as their theological project, when Cone, in the context of the United States, already was thinking politically without thinking with Schmidt about this? And I'm not, anti that, but I'm saying it becomes a curiosity that this becomes this resurgence of this political theology, when political theology is just intrinsic, embedded. You can't disentangle it from Black faith.
Yeah. So some people, I'm guessing, haven't read Carl Schmitt, and I let me let me say back to you as someone who has, but like what the point you were trying to make, and then you can like critique it or push back or reformulate it.
Okay.
Um, just in a way that people don't feel left out. So Carl Schmitt is a German philosopher, Nazi German philosopher,
Right,
uh,
exactly.
who has been he has significantly shaped European political theology, and then has shaped in multiple ways kind of Anglo political theology, precisely because Carl Schmitt, uh, be, because European domination systems abstract the logic of the divine, think logos of the divine theology, from the material conditions, and then take the structure of reflection based on the divine, the ultimate. And then if you move it out of religion, as what? As you get the rise of secular states, as you get the rise of a kind of post-Christendom context where there's one religious meta-narrative, then the state, then there's a migration of the holy, of the domination system story from religion to the state. Carl Schmitt goes, yeah, it's important to see this. Right now, what kind of logic and language do we use to justify the power of the state? It's theological logic. Political thinking and justification is the same as theology. And if we want to understand how to do politics well, then the question is, who is the God? Who is the exception? And once you understand where what resides, omnipotent, intervenious, self-justificating power, then you start to get a logic. Now, the critics of this totalitarian, authoritarian style thinking, what they do is to occupy the abstraction of theology from the religious situatedness to European political thinking, and then critique it. And there's a lot of contemporary political philosophy and theology that addresses it. But what Cohn is in some way it is an attack on it, or at least the way I read him, is the problem was always the abstraction of the logic of the one, of the God, of the ultimate from material conditions. The incarnation and the cross and the lynching tree are God's self-testimony and self-identification with what the one does violence to. So to then come up with an abstracted account of the deity that then, because of secularization, the shift of Europe, migrates from religion to the state, and then you have fights about it, that's missing the point. The whole logic of the Christian logos isn't a top-down power structure that gets right back up to the omnipotent deity. It's that God has identified with the cross and all those who bear crosses. And that's a different logic that doesn't justify the exception to the rules. And I think that like once you get what like what's happening here, like why you titled this week Christ from the Underside, it's a recognition that you can actually see Christ from a place of privilege. You can actually see Christ from a place of domination and supremacy. Like you can come up with those versions of the Christ, just like you can come up with versions of theology, like, and then make it political, like Carl Schmitt. Abstraction takes us away from bodies, and it takes us away from the way power works out in perverse ways.
Yeah, yeah, and I'll even say it simpler. Schmidt really argued, right, that all concepts of modern theories are secularized theology, right? But that makes sense for the context of Europe. But in the context of the United States, America's always been a civil religion, right? Like when I say America, that's a political and a theological concept, right? So in the context of Black theology, Cohn writes a book called Martin, Malcolm in America, right? So he's talking about the legacy of Martin, the legacy of Malcolm, and the legacy of America, right? Which he's reading theologically. So America in the context of Black theology has always been read because the mythology of America functions religiously, right? If you burn the flag, it's similar to burning the cross, right? So the point being is that to actually have to to import a European theorist for something that we've indigenously been developing, it just seems to be um, um, a step that is not necessary. I like some of the concepts. Don't get me wrong, and I like some of the work. It's just very curious to me that they bypass the work of Cohn and go right to Schmidt in a way where I'm seeing a lot of what's happening more intimately within Black theological figures.
Mhm,
Right?
mhm. So, do you think that part of the danger of these abstractions, right, um that pull a truth away from its fleshliness, I mean, it sets up for kinds of dualisms, and
Sure.
in looking through the reading, there are a number that came up, and I wonder which ones you would dwell on. So, like, one is between bodies and the spirit. Uh,
Yeah.
Other
Yeah.
was between guilt and shame.
Mm.
Another was the victim and the violator, and then
Mm.
between cross and glory.
Mm.
And
Mm.
one of the things that struck me in all of those kind of dualisms, that if you are going to abstract the gospel from the material world in such a way that there's no real demands made upon your allegiance to change conditions of suffering and injustice, then you need a binary, and then you need to privilege one. And it seems to me that a lot of these distinctions Cohn is raising to then problematize that in the distinction is like the gateway to the abstraction.
Yeah. I get your question, your point. Here's how I would like to frame it for people, especially if you're new. We're really trying to talk about the cross in the lynching tree is an intervention into Christology, right? So for those of you who kind of, know, or let's just give a quick overview. For theologians, Jesus Christ is like Christ is not the last name of Jesus, right? It's not Jesus Johnson, Jesus Washington, right? Christ is a title, right? So you have the historical Jesus, and then you have the Christ of faith, right? So the way Cohn thinks about this is about let's look at the historical Jesus and who the historical Jesus is, right? And then let's look at the Christ of faith, right? And this is actually did this work way before the cross and the lynching tree. We focus on the cross and the lynching tree because that's what he's one of his last works, or the work he's most proud of. But before that, he was writing about Christology too, and he talked about the blackness of Christ, or Christ as liberator, right? And he was doing that based on looking at who the historical Jesus is. And this gets back to your questions of dualities, because there's a lot of dualities between the way people think about these these issues. Um, and for Black theology and liberation theology, in general, how we land and identify who the historical Jesus has a lot to say about what the meaning of Christian faith actually is, right? Because for Cone, Christ is where human beings are enslaved, right? Or let me back up. We're trying to talk about a living God, right? Not the God of a tradition. Cohn is thinking about this, and he's seeing this in the context of struggle, in the context of suffering, and he's really asking himself, where is God today? Not just who God was in the past, but where is God today? So the gospel, as he reads in the first century, was something that threatens, something that unsettles, something that disturbs, something that overturns the security of the powerful, the privileged, and offers security to the poor. And not because they're intrinsically better, but because they're open to a complete trust in God. So what he called Black theology early on was a Black Copernican revolution, right? Something so significant. It changed from a Earth-centered universe to a sun-centered universe. That's what it is when he challenged what he referred to as the American Christ, right? And the American Christ is followed by both black folks and white folks alike. But the American Christ, right? Like it's something that people are deeply invested in it. And the American Christ is a race transcending deity who just happens to be white, right? The whiteness of Christ is taken for granted, normalized, unmarked, right? And it's unmarked until it's challenged, right? Because the whiteness of Jesus seems incidental. It just happens to be the case that white. But then when you challenge it, the resistance is so fierce, you can see it's non-negotiable, right? So the American Christ is tied to racial and economic privilege. So what Cone comes in to try to radicalize the gospel, what he argues is that the idea of the American Christ, right, de-radicalize the gospel because it becomes an idol, right? So the blackness is there to try to come in to liberate it from its domesticated captivity, right? And to see it as radical. That's the starting point for Christ, for him. He later comes in and further tries to radicalize it by putting it with the cross, right? And the idea of de radicalizing it is always a critique of abstraction, as you mentioned, the lack of concrete and specificity, and the kind of what's so called the sloppy God. The God is for everybody and everything, right? That God does not take sides and positions. And what he really wants to have is much more of a material, concrete basis for locating God's activity in the world.
Mm-hmm. And I think like each of those elements are important, right? Because on each of the implied criticism to American Jesus is like, what about the incarnation? Right? Like underneath it is no, that it is situated, that it is material, that it does take sides, that the event of God's self-testimony, God's identification with finitude most deeply was something that was embedded in the web of relations, and the power situation, the arrangement towards flourishing or ill, all those things were like intrinsic parts of it. And it, I here's one question. What's her name? Amy asked. She said after the last time y'all did a class together, I became more and more aware of all the things I skipped over when reading the Bible. And it wasn't skipping over the words, it was skipping over the context that makes the words sting.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And now I can't not see it. It's, I wonder, like for you,
it's beautiful.
Like what was that like in discovering the I can't not see it as a student of Cone? Like what in watching him in the classroom, being mentored by him and such. Like I'm sure if I'm a professor, if I get an email that's like, you did such a good job, I could not see this anymore, I'm going to be like, hell yeah, but I couldn't not see that. Like, what are the elements or the hermeneutics, right, of in a person when Cone's like, oh, I did a good job as a mentor.
Well, here's what before I met him, let me say, when I first encountered him through his writings, what intrigued me about Black theology was the sense that Christ is a revolutionary, right? I had never heard that before. Like there's something called the revolutionary Christ. I was like, to me, and I was 19, 18 years old when I first heard about the sense that Christ is a revolutionary. Like to me, and my image of Christ was Christ is a nice guy, right? To actually, kind of frame Christ as someone who's an activist or a protester or even sympathetic to that's a primary identity, it just captured my imagination. And then I started reading. I had actually a chaplain, a university chaplain I remember trained, who actually used to use what's it, Clarence Jordan's Cotton Patch Bible, right? And he would do his sermons in his kind of youth groups and use like all of these type of like metaphors and apply them to like the South in the 1950s using race, right? Clarence
Oh
Jordan
yeah.
was right. It's a you're
Oh
familiar with
yeah.
that. You're from the South, right?
Oh, I'm a Baptist. We don't. Let me just tell you that
Go ahead.
as a white Baptist from the South, how many people do you think we can pick as our heroes that other people might know? Like it this like if you look at my wall, you know, Clarence Jordan's one of them. I wrote my undergrad thesis on him. But then it's like Walter Rauschenbusch, Martin Luther King Jr. Like you don't have a
But
lot of Baptists.
people don't know about him anymore, though. People don't read him anymore, right? Like I go ahead. Why don't you riff on him for a bit?
All right. Well, he took Jesus too seriously, and this was in the 50s. He starts a farm in Americus, Georgia, and it is a intentional community and a farm. It's interracial. They sell peanuts and stuff. It gets bombed pretty consistently. He becomes a preacher. He does his PhD in New Testament at Southern Seminary. This is how much Southern Baptist Theological Seminary has changed. Is that now Al Mohler's in charge, and they used to give PhDs to Clarence Jordan. The most
Wow.
famous thing out of Clarence Jordan is that there was one really famous person who's intimately connected, and it's Jimmy Carter, because one of the first interns at the farm itself started Habitat for Humanity, and then they were all friends because of Georgia and that kind of stuff. But if you read his sermons, then which I read everything that had been published by him when I wrote the thesis on him, but the thing that struck me, and this was and I mentioned this earlier, like in my world, my parents were like the edgy racial reconciliation types, which for the 90s were edgy on race issues kind of thing. And then like thinking like, oh, I have an ally. And I got uncomfortable with the stuff he said, because he would say things like, if you've never been called a insert profane word lover or a commie, I question if you're a disciple of Jesus. And things like
Wow.
that. And he would just like
Wow.
mention it, right? And then he goes in and he goes, he tells the story of the Good Samaritan, which is brought up, right? Like in the reading. And in the story of the Good Samaritan, who are the people that pass by? The Southern preacher at First Baptist Church, the head of the choir, and then this black guy leaving a blues joint late at night, still a little tipsy. And then he goes, who's the neighbor? And then he goes, and like in the sermons, he says things like, well, it's the one, I think he might have been drinking, but I mean, he still did a good thing, right? Like, and then Jesus is like, well, it starts asking all the questions. And so I think Clarence Jordan, like in what are the Cotton Patch Gospels, right? Like he basically is a New Testament scholar and then goes, our context matters, right? Like it's a very similar thing that you can't, if you abstract the text, then all of a sudden you can sing a hymn about God taking sides and then wear a sheet and burn a cross. And Clarence Jordan just didn't think that was reasonable, right? And so and obviously he has a different task as a Southern Baptist, in the South. But the Cotton Patch Gospels, I think, they were earth shattering to me, just because it was so stark to have your religious world become the context for Jesus showing up, and then realizing that you've read the Bible so poorly because you identified with the very people you didn't attend to their well-being. And you put yourself in the position of Jesus's disciples, his allies, supporters, when really, if you put it in the historical, material, political, cultural context, like you are the opponents of the kingdom of God.
Wow. Wow.
And one of my favorite things about Clarence Jordan is every time you get the kingdom of God, he calls it the God movement.
Yeah,
And
that's right. That's right.
and
That's right.
and the reason he said he's like, because I've met both politicians and people that trust them.
Wow. Amazing. That's a brilliant deep dive. And I didn't know some of that stuff that you mentioned because I was introduced to a black male Baptist preacher, right, who's pairing Jordan and Cone together in our
It's a,
Bible
it
studies,
makes sense.
right? But you gave me that context. I didn't know about him personally, so I'm just really getting him through his writings and how
Mm-hmm.
he's framing the story and about the God movement. And he would always lead. He would always talk in his sermons about joining the God movement and talking
Mm-hmm.
about Cohen is extending how the God movement is done in the context of the United States. So you gave me some background to even understand my 19-year-old self hearing this message that really laid the seeds for me to appreciate Cohen even deeper when I started to like find out my own. Because I'm just hitting here, I'm not doing any primary research, right? I'm just receiving these sermons saying, wow, I've never like feeling angry at my religious instruction, right? Like saying that, why have I never heard this before? Like I felt like lied to, I felt like misled. And then hearing all of this amazing things about the gospel and just about historical criticism in general. And I got so fascinated and became, that really spawned my religious pursuit as a teenager. Right. So to really kind of comment on that is that Jordan took race very seriously, and obviously Cone did too. So you have a white male and a black male who are taking race seriously, and I'm having this frame, and then I'm hearing about a revolutionary Christ, right? And I'm like, what kind of revolution is this? And it would make we start a God movement that's a community of the unexpected, where people are actually joining together in a spirit, right? That are unified not by blood but by spirit. And I'm like, oh dang, that's very interesting. And then what actually comes also into the phrase Howard Thurman, right? That gives a spiritual depth. And Howard Thurman's Jesus and the Disinherited, right, comes into the frame. Let me actually like do a chapter that kind of this actually precedes Cone in terms of thinking about this in the Black community. But in Jesus and the Disinherited, his first chapter, he writes about he's going to visit Mahatma Gandhi, and he's with this delegation, and I'm going to read you this chapter that kind of kicks off even Cone's and influences Cone's thinking about Christology later on. In the fall of 1935, I was serving as a chairman of a delegation sent on a pilgrimage of friendship from the students of America to the students of India, Burma, and Ceylon. It was at a meeting in Ceylon that this whole crucial issue was pointed out in a way I could never forget. At the close of a talk at a law college at the University of Colombo on civil disobedience under states' rights in the United States, I was invited by the principal to have a cup of coffee. We drank our coffee in silence, and after the service had been removed, he said to me, "What are you doing here?" I know what the newspapers say about a pilgrimage of friendship and the rest, but that's not my question. What are you doing here? And then he goes on to explain this is what I mean. More than 300 years ago, your forefathers were taken from the western coast of Africa as slaves. The people who dealt in the slave traffic were Christians. One of your famous Christian hymn writers, Sir John Newton, made his money from the sale of slaves to the New World. He is the man who wrote, "How Sweet the Name of Jesus Sounds," and "Amazing Grace." And there may be others, but those are the ones I know. The name of one of the most famous British slave vessels was Jesus. The men who brought the slaves were Christian ministers, quoting Christian Apostle Paul, gave the sanction of religion to the system of slavery. Some 70 years some 70 years or more ago, you were freed by a man who was not a professing Christian. Rather, he was the spearhead of certain political, social, and economic forces, the significance of which he himself did not understand. During all of this period, you have lived in a Christian nation in which you were segregated, lynched, and burned. Even the church, I understand, there is segregation. One of the students who went to your country sent me a clipping telling about a church in which regular Sunday service was interrupted so a man could join a mob, which meant a lynch mob, against one of your fellows. When he had caught and been done to death, they came back to worship their Christian God. And then he looks at Thurman. He says, Howard Thurman, I am a Hindu. I do not understand. You are here in my country standing deep within the Christian tradition and faith. I do not wish to be rude to you, but sir, I think you're a traitor to all the darker people of earth. And I'm wondering, you as an intelligent man, what can you say in defense of your position? And Thurman just said, wow. Stood back, a lot of silence, and started to really think, why am I choosing this? Right? He's in India, right? India is Hindu, even though they have British colonization, but they didn't become Christian. So he's wondering for himself. So Thurman comes up with this kind of articulation where he talks about the difference between the religion of Jesus and the religion about Jesus, right? He says the religion of Jesus is to believe God the way Jesus believed God. The religion about Jesus is what people say about Jesus, right? So for him, and you could parallel this to what James Cone is doing. Cone is trying to make a distinction between the religion of Jesus, how Jesus understood, and the religion about Jesus, which he's using racial metaphors, right? White religion as a metaphor for talking about the religion about Jesus. Constantinian Christianity about the religion about Jesus, and prophetic Christianity as the way Jesus understood God, right? And those are the metaphors that work throughout Black theology, right? That really come from Thurman, who's writing this in the 1950s, right, while he's in India, and they get carried through by Cone by using these racial signifiers to try to give it more bite, right? But they're really pushing for the same thing, right? They're trying to liberate and have a way of understanding who Christ is that deals with the idea of racial domination, right? That doesn't have a spiritual bypass, but deals with it in its most concrete and material form. And that to understand and be faithful to Jesus is to be a disruptor, right? Is to interrupt the logic of domination and point to new realities.
Yeah. I think the question, that Howard Thurman was asked by Gandhi about being a traitor is.
No, it was a lawyer. It wasn't Gandhi himself.
Okay.
It was a lawyer who was actually on his trip to try to see
with
Gandhi
him.
in the pilgrimage. Yeah.
But I think that question's an important one that, is kind of assumed, right, as one worth losing sleep over in both the two chapters we read, right? Because you have and if people are more interested in this, they should go check out the previous class because Adam did an amazing lecture about this whole thing. But that the in a sense, at least my shorthand version, you can expand it and give the answer, but is that when you steal and possess people from one continent and move them to another, and they aren't even in the same, they may not speak the same language or context when slave traders bring them to the United States, and then you put them in places, break up their family structures, break up their linguistic structures, all these kind of things. There's a kind of rupture to your symbolic and narrative inheritance where what ways do we cling to life? How can we look at injustice and such and pain and struggle and even just assert my own humanness, right? Like I think that's one of the elements in the second chapter we read about the blues element that was so important, that the blues becomes this affirmation of humanity. Like in what ways do we even get to that affirmation of humanity? What religion gives is a way to even fortify the possibility of hope. When there's this rupture that all of a sudden atomizes individuals, puts them in a new place, and then the dominant regime tells a story that is now permitted, gives a text that you're allowed to engage and such. Like, what do you do with that tradition? And then are you a traitor for inheriting it on behalf of liberation?
Mm,
Like, that
mm.
to me is such a important question. One, okay, I'll pause there because my follow-ups will derail. But I mean, is there more you want to say about that? Because I, until last time when we were talking about this, I had never thought about the fact that, like, I'm now in the UK. I went to a graveyard that has my ancestors in it from 600 years ago.
Wow.
I don't know. Like, I don't know who the hell they are, but in Scrooby, England, there's a whole lot of Fullers. And I know that's where we left because we were radical reformers.
Mm,
And I met some other Fullers and we look similar. So, like we were always edgy Protestants for a long time.
mm-hmm.
And so I have this inheritance, but then we were all, anyway, like that's such a different story. I had not thought
Yeah.
about it till you were giving the lecture. I think it was the second week last time, about like the profundity of Black Christian expression is that it was precisely the narratives and texts handed to them by the slaveholders that were
Absolutely.
then read against them.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a different interpretation. He's really, the way, well, first of all, let me introduce it. Let me insert this so that people can understand the direction of Black theology. Malcolm X is the first, through the voice of Elijah Muhammad, really, is the first major Black figure to critique Christianity for being intrinsically wrong. Before that, people thought that Christianity was just practiced wrong, not that there was anything that it had a limited vision, right? Malcolm was the first one by calling it white and saying it had a limited vision, that there was an intrinsic critique. So there's a book by Mark Chapman called Christianity on Trial, right? Let's try Christianity, not just the people, but there might be something intrinsic to Christianity that is unredemptive, right? So the 60s was the first time that people started to wrestle with the idea that there might be something um, intrinsically limiting or oppressive about Christianity. All other folks, at least in the Black community, thought that, well, it's about the practice. It's about the practice. It's about the practice. And what Black theology did is that it's not just the practice, there's an interpretive scheme, right, at work here that is actually oppressive. So there's an epistemological problem, not just a problem of practice alone. And the way Cone puts it very simply, if you don't act right, you don't think right, right? Like you wouldn't accept Christianity from a batterer, right? Somehow the way they're thinking about Christianity is wrong. So he says there's no, getting back to your thing about dualism, there shouldn't be a dichotomy between acting and thinking. If someone's acting in violent and subhuman, dehumanizing way, then how are you going to trust their interpretation of Christian faith, right? So that's where professional theologians started to come in and started to say, hey, we got to rethink these things because we're holding people authoritative who do not act right, especially on the issues of race, right? So that's what's happening with intervention. I think Malcolm is the one who kind of sets that apart and causes, Cone to say, well, we could do two things. We could throw the whole tradition out, we can acquiesce and assimilate into the existing tradition, or we can reconstruct the tradition. And Black theology is the reconstructive initiative in the Black community, saying that we don't want to throw it out and we can't assimilate to what it is. So let's talk about how can we reconstruct it as a liberating force. That's
Mhm.
the thrust of Black theology.
Yeah. So, so this is something that has popped in my mind recently, and it could just be because of the two classes I'm teaching this semester. I'm teaching philosophy of religion, and then the religion science class that of a year-long class, but the half that's biology and like social sciences, brain sciences, that kind of thing. And one of the things that popped in my mind when thinking about just the category of religion is that a lot of it covers over, if you just use it generically, a lot of distinctives. And one of the distinctives about the Abrahamic faiths is that they cultivate historical consciousness, that
Mm,
within
mm,
part of monotheistic traditions that assert that the one good God desires something specific for the world is that it begs you to ask the question, in your world and in your situation, what does God want? Um, and philosophers of religion regularly draw this contrast. Um, and this is one of the reasons philosophers of religion problematize the category of religion, because most of the wisdom traditions from the East don't act. The problem's not history; it's the individual, it's suffering, these kind of things. Your
mm,
relationship to the whole.
mm,
Um, and if you look at the concept of history and where it emerges in the Abrahamic faiths, it and in the West, it happens there, and so in some sense, uh, and this wasn't set in relation to a kind of American theology, but there are a couple different philosophers of religion who point out that um, if historical consciousness is essential for religious self-understanding, there's always been a dynamic in its expressions where there are religions that are fitting one for the domination system and religions that are fitting one to critique the domination system. And this would be true for, well, you can go all the way back to like the one monotheistic representation in Egypt, but also like mainly Judaism, Christianity, Islam.
sure,
And
sure.
and I say that because what's fascinating to me is that this wasn't about this class, but there's a couple of philosophers that recently published papers basically saying the problem of nihilism and all sorts of stuff uh, in contemporary Western context is that the West doesn't know what to do when the majority of people in it don't know the right question, because the West has always had this kind of question of being on the right side, and then it's like, what is the right side? Well, what happens when the market subsumes, right, the big story we're all living in? Like, how do you have a historical consciousness when the market's doing it? It atomizes people, it alienates them, and all this other kind of stuff. And after I read this paper and was rethinking through the end of this semester, I I like I was preparing for that, and then have been rereading our reading, and here's the question that's set up for it. What if recognizing that one of the essential tasks for a monotheistic tradition is giving people a hermeneutic for understanding the present, where beautiful expressions of a tradition, right? And you see both in the Hebrew scriptures, right? Domination system stories and the prophetic story is forming people to join a collective of the prophetic story towards the totalitarian story of the domination system. And it, like, when you draw that question of power through the history of Israel and the history of the church, the ones we go, that's a saint worth having, right, are the ones who go, shouldn't you be a traitor too? what is dominant at their time. And so much of it's connected to, where is God taking sides in this place? What is the material reality where how you show up reveals your allegiance to the divine? And I'm more and more convicted around the fact that Black theology continues to be an elective in the academy among American seminaries and American theological education, and not normative for what faithful Christianities look like since we showed up.
Sure, sure. Well, absolutely. I mean, Black theologians say all theology is Black theology. All true Christian theology is Black theology. But let me get to, and the reason why they say this, and let me unpack that. What's meant by that? Because of what you said about um, the way. Well, let me back it up. What we're trying to understand here is how God's activity in the world. Through the Hebraic tradition, God functions through history and culture primarily, right? It's just about whose history and culture. That's where it's like God from the underside, right? Christ from the underside. You're looking at the culture and history of those on the underside, not because they're intrinsically better. You could find jerks on the underside too, and mean people as well, but because that's where God is located, God's self-choosing, right, to reveal God's self as a statement against the world, against empire, right? So that's what it is. If somehow, in another universe, Blackness was not, disadvantage, right? It was privilege, then the metaphor would shift, right? So what Cohen is trying to use this metaphorically and talk about a location. It's a Blackness against empire, right? I think there's a Panther book called that, Blackness against empire, right? So it's a way of trying to talk about poking empire from the standpoint of below. So that's where the traditions of God speaking through a distinctive history and culture, right? So it makes the exact point that a lot of German theologians were trying to get away from, like Barth and people like that, because they had suprematist, overly confident cultures, right? So in order to hear God, you had to draw God out, or you had to make a big distinction between humanity and culture. But if you have a humanity that's beaten up, bruised, the greatest affirmation is to say that God is in your history and culture, right? It's a reparative act versus a supremacist act,
So
right?
is that so there's like a way in which the Barth and who's the forerunner, right, for European political theology via
Mm-hmm.
Moltmann, Johann Baptist Metz, and such, to have a political theology that's not demonic in Europe, it's the otherness of God that makes
Absolutely.
space for it.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
To have a
Mm-hmm.
political theology in the United States, it's the blackness of God that makes it possible. And it's just so much that in Europe, right, like especially in Germany, the otherness of God is precisely the Jewishness of Jesus and God's identity, God as a Jew, right?
That's
So
interesting.
it's like extra religion. It's like it's another religion. But in the United States, it's not primarily a country whose like racism is anti-Semitic, though Lord knows we're coming up with that ways to do that, but it's
Right, right, right.
primarily about the otherness of like Africans that were brought here, Native Americans who were here, and all of them are under the erasure of the story, right? Like the European colonialists were telling.
Yeah, no, I like where you're going. Like here's another way of saying that. You know, the Jews were the degraded others of Europe, just as blacks are the degraded others of America. There are books like J. Cameron Carter and Willie Jennings who really talk about how anti Semitism is a racialized subject, right? Like before before Europeans encountered Africans, right, there was a concept of race that came through their anti Semitism, right? It just that was imposed on African bodies, right, later on. But internally, the idea of race, it was even it turns on Irish bodies as well at some point. But the concept of race before there was like this type of modern encounters between Europeans and Africans, that Europe developed certain contexts of otherness and race, and then it became concretized onto blackness and color later on. But there's a historical evolvement of that concept, right? So there is some work. So you can understand the Jew as a racialized subject, right? Because they were seen as a different, a fundamentally different species of humanity, the same way Africans were later understood that way.
Yeah. It like when you make that connection and then you think of the first chapter we read, all the times that Cohen says something like, what does it mean to affirm blackness in a world determined by white supremacy?
Mm, yeah.
Like, like
Yeah.
I know as a white Southerner, like how uncomfortable it is to read that the first time.
Mm,
Do you know when I wasn't uncomfortable reading that?
mm.
It's important to read the historical Jesus as a Jew, because what we're like, yeah, well, I mean, it was Jewish, right?
Yeah.
Like, and I feel like that even thinking back to the places I was uncomfortable with, that part of it, like to me, that's like even more evidence that the cross and the lynching tree connection is so important for us to get. Because and I get that if you're sitting around here going like, am I more white than I am Christian? Like that gets uncomfortable. And I think I constantly have to wrestle with that. But like, I know what I really want to be. Like, I really want to be a faithful disciple. I would love for my family and friends to be like, he sucked, but he really tried hard. Right. And there are these basic observations about the way power plays out in the New Testament that, standing where we are now, we can see how European theology gave birth to anti-Semitism that justified itself with the name of Christ.
Uh-huh.
But we're more uncomfortable if you are a white Protestant Christian in America, seeing that same activity coming up when the Black Lives Matter movement says Black Lives Matter, and you're like, hold it, but all, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that I just think that's important, because it's the symbolic dominance of whiteness that then justifies the material oppression and injustice that I think comes to the fore. It especially in the first chapter we read.
Right.
And
You
it's
have
the
to.
paradox of the cross that reveals it. And that's why Cone is like, I mean, you can moralize someone if you want. And we see how effective that is. I don't know any extra people that got a vaccine because I made snarky comments on the internet. But the cross is not a moralizing. It's a
No.
self-testimony of God, right? Like that's what Cone's going at. It's like God told us who
No,
got
you're
it.
right. You're right. I mean, part of this. I mean, part of this is you have to have it. You have to have some type of symbolic literacy, right? You have to read both religious and cultural symbols. So the cross and the lynching tree, of course, are separated by 2,000 years, but they're both symbolic. The cross represents a symbol of Christian faith, right? The lynching tree is a symbol of Black oppression in America. Both the cross and lynching tree have underlying messages. The key thing here is both represent death, right? The cross is an overcoming of death, right? A message of hope and salvation, right? The lynching tree is death via white supremacy, right? What Cohen's program is to try to explore the connections through death, because both are extra legal, right? Like in terms of that. Well, the lynching tree tried extra legal. The cross, not maybe not so much, but it's an extra legal punishment sanctioned by the community, and both are seen as necessary acts to protect the community, right, from degraded others, right? Whites didn't see themselves as doing anything wrong when they were lynching. They saw himself as preserving the integrity of the community, kind of
Yeah.
Gerardian type of scapegoat, right? The same thing with that. It's just
It-
that when you understand them together, you understand that the cross and the lynching tree don't have the last word. That's what the cross does for the lynching tree. That death is not the last word, right? And that's what Cohen is exploring. That there's something that uncontrollable. That the victory of the cross is a victory that says there's something in you that can conquer death. There's a power in you that can't be controlled by the lynching tree, right? There's a transcendent power. And that's the hope for oppressed communities, to be in touch with that power and the promise and the faith that power will end up in a way that's not defined by the terror of the world, but there's a surplus, right? There's a
yeah.
surplus.
So it, in like crucifixion, and this is something Cohn points out, is for Romans, it's a punishment reserved for disobedient slaves and rebels against the empire.
Mm-hmm.
Roman citizens were not crucified because it was shameful. It was painful.
Yes,
It was a designation of submission, right, to the person. It wasn't just an example of like a state sanctioned execution. It was like state sponsored torture. It's like the electric chair tag teamed with Gitmo. Um, and and I think that recognizing how it functioned, then the meaning of the crucifixion that Cohn's seeking is to recover that charisma, right? Like part of the fascination, and you get these kind of asides towards German biblical scholarship in the reading, is to recover the charisma of the historical Jesus. And Cohn's just wanting to go like, no, like the charisma, like the entire story, all of you New Testament scholars say everything other than the Passion Week is like side, like an elective, if you were taking a class, to the Passion Week where he dies on a cross. The charisma of the gospel, because all four gospels center on it, is the cross. The cross has a meaning. And if you abstract it from this context, it's just nuts that you think you're going to come up with something where the slaveholder is hearing good news and it doesn't make demands on his identity as a slaveholder. And so, like the cross and a lynching tree, that parallel between Roman execution of Jews and American lynchings of blacks, both have the same political purpose, right? The lynching and the execution on the cross are to terrorize oppressed people so they don't rebel against their oppression.
Right. It's
And he
also the
points that out like over and over. And here, and this was something that stuck out this time when reading it. If the cross and lynching tree function to terrorize the oppressed so they don't speak out against it so much that connection only sneaks out with poets who then get reprimanded, right? In the second chapter.
No, that's key.
Then
That's really key.
if that's where it sneaks out, but the connection is real, then in what ways we have to ask ourselves as the church, have we internalized a logic of suppression and repression about God's self-testimony in Jesus and on the cross that then enhances, upbuilds, and supports a culture of supremacy? But the reason we ask that question is precisely because of the cross. And what is the resurrection when you put it in context other than like God going, no, right? To that whole logic. The resurrection is God's response that this logic is not accurate. It's not final. It cannot be equated with goodness or justice or truth or beauty. And if you want to know what any of those beautiful words get you attached to the divine, then you're going to have to go through this. What? Good Friday. It has to go through the reality of the cross and the reality of the lynching tree.
Yeah, or what Bonhoeffer named the cost of discipleship, right? I mean, what's really at stake here is that how do you find new life possibilities, right? Especially in the midst of terror, right? And the cross is a way of trying to navigate new life possibilities in the midst of intense forms of suffering, right? And the book is really like a sustained meditation into how Black folks navigating this, through slavery and segregation, and using their faith to try to speak to new life and reimagine new life possibilities.
I I was talking with well, he didn't say, I could say his name. So a friend of mine who's a Episcopalian minister in the United States, who texted me in the section halfway through the second chapter we read, right where Du Bois is page 105, but Du Bois asked the question of theodicy, but in the
Mm-hmm.
context of Black suffering in America, right? But it's posed back to the Black church, and in a way that, like, why are you going to use the word God and good and Jesus and Christ, given the material conditions and suffering and the history of its legacy here? And my friend that texted me said, I've never even thought of asking that question, right? As a mainline Protestant minister that's very white. And then reading it, I thought, I don't even know what I would answer if my kid asked me that question if I was a Black minister. And he said, I don't know if it's because, one, religion has never functioned for me in the same kind of liberative way that Cone describes it in chapter 1. Right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that is the narrative and communal resource of hope that asserts our humanity in an inhumane world.
Right, yeah, yeah.
But also just like, is the desire is it hold on, let me pull it up. Yeah. I don't know if this is really racist about my own people, but white people just aren't joiners.
That they what?
They aren't joiners. And
Okay,
yeah,
okay,
like
okay.
joiners, he goes, the idea that I would put my whole life on the line for a symbolic structure that we weren't in charge of and maintaining is wild. And
Wow, that's
and
deep. Yeah, that's deep.
and, and he goes, I don't even know if, he was saying, like, I don't even know how comfortable I am asking this question, but I think it's really important. But that theodicy question that he lingers on, I, I'm fascinated how you've heard it, like in your own life and experience, both prior to kind of encountering Black theology, which you talked about earlier. It's like how you've managed to stay connected to the church and to theology, but also since it, and looking at how America's continued to wrestle with this.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, uh, would you pose Du Bois' question in the same way, differently? How have you existentially handled it as a theologian?
Well, I'll say how it's been raised in the tradition. I mean, the question of theodicy has been raised. If God is all good, if God is all powerful, then why do whites live so well and blacks live so lowly? Right? So, what kind of God? So, think about if you're in the 19th century, right? And you're coming out of slavery or even in the midst of slavery, and all you see, every time you see a Black community, you see something that is actually broken and beat down. And then you see white communities and they're flourishing, and they are the ones who are enslaving you. How could God say that's okay? Right? It makes you have different things about yourself and your own people, right? So, that became the question of theodicy. And so what Malcolm first did was say, he answered it this way. He said, the problem is not God is all good and God is all powerful. It's that you have the wrong God. You have this Christian God. Take this Muslim God, right? And then you'll have that answer really respond better. right? So Malcolm just replaced the God concepts. They thought it was the Christian God that's working against Black flourishing and Black freedom, right? Other people, and there's a tradition of humanism, which Anthony Penwork writes about, that really tries to talk about that we need to talk about, an ethical or a secular humanism, and that the very idea of a theistic way, road to struggle is something that is harmful. And that's mostly educated classes that would do that. You had some people who just assimilated into the structures that were, which you always will have, which is part of what oppression is. And then you have like the kind of the radical response that tries to reconstruct the God concept, right? In a way. So Black theology is like the fourth response. It's the reconstructionist response, right? That tries to reframe evil in a way that it can be encountered meaningfully, so that evil starts to become a way of trying to say, no, this is not, God does not sanction this state of affairs, right? And it starts to talk about God wants us to live into a new possibility and trying to articulate that. So issues of beloved community is that new possibility. Issues of moral community, issues of the kingdom, right? So that's what at the forefront of Black struggle is trying to put forth moral visions that we're supposed to live into, right? And it's a contrast against empire, right, which is a dominant vision. And instead of assimilating to empire, it's this vision that's a direct contrast that is much more of an egalitarian and vision of justice.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how it's usually worked out in the context
Yeah.
of the Black theological terrain, and people have different points and different perspectives within that. But that's the kind of broader framework in which is being
So,
situated.
well, well uh, would you like to say anything about it personally as someone who, and you've mentioned before, like, your family is Episcopalian, right? Which is
Right.
normal, the dominant expression of the Black church, but also you're at a Jesuit school. So you
Sure.
have the benefit of like not the normal Catholic experience, but like Jesuit experience, which is its
Yeah.
different flavor. You also were connected to a number of local justice groups, but also contemplative groups, right? Like your experience with the church is a little more broad, I think, from all the communities you're in. But when you're in that kind of like breadth of space, just as an individual and as a Black theologian, like, do you think, how do you think differently because of that space about the question of theodicy posed, right, like towards the Black church?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I'm trying to think how the best because I don't tend to think about, theodicy assumes a certain type of logic and structure of the world, right? That I don't necessarily share, like in terms of that. And this might get way too philosophical. I just think about ways we can kind of overcome, oppression and evil through personal social transformation, right? So I try to take the best of what's um, um, of the tradition and try to reform it in a way that makes sense for my particularity,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of that. So for me, evil is something, I don't want to have this kind of, um, I see it as something similar to code that doesn't have the last word, right? But it's something that's never eradicated totally, right? That there's always going to be forces of good and bad that we're always wrestling with, and that we have to encourage people to live up to their best self, the better angels, right? In terms of that, Niebuhr always talks about how what happens oftentimes in protest movements that you might reproduce the sin that you think you're conquering,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
so you have to live by grace and be very humble, and I'm very self-conscious of that because most of the social justice movement I'm aware of do quite that. You might, as soon as you might eliminate a form of social or political oppression, you reproduce another one, right? So to me, it's always like you always live by a certain form of grace and a certain form of humility, and there's a certain form of openness to be challenged and pushed in new
Mhm.
directions, right?
Yeah.
So to me, it's um I think about it as a kind of a creative fidelity, right? Like trying to live
Creative
creatively.
fidelity. That's
Yeah.
a that that's a book title, at least an article title.
But it's trying to live creatively, like within the context of it, using the best of your traditions to make sense of the world. That's how I tend
Mhm.
to think about it. Mhm.
Yeah. So the I I would love to have you frame the question of the cross, right? So this week you get to hear some of Cohn's, but one, like how he sees the cross, but also his engagement in his response to some of the womanist pushbacks to how his earlier work. Um,
Yeah.
and and it's been a while since the books come out. So like if you were thinking through uh a spectrum of different responses or interpretations of the cross in Black theology, like what are the kind of like centering points or different emphases or questions that run through your mind as ones to that if you isolate them, it helps you get the texture of the conversation.
Now, are you talking about that particular book, or are you talking about his work in general?
Well, his work in general, just that this work in general shows that the question of the cross has always been central
Yeah.
for Black theological reflection in America,
Sure. Yeah.
but
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
like we know the cross is central. We don't exactly know what it means because we have different ways of understanding the critique of power, right? Like at the cross.
Right. Right.
Um,
Right. Right. And you know what?
quick question.
So,
There, I hear weird noises coming through on your end.
yeah. Yeah. There's something background. Hold
Oh,
on.
okay. Oh, I just anyway. You the question of the cross, I think, is really important. Um, because when we talk about Christ from the underside, it Christ's identity being connected to the underside is kind of determined by his death on a cross. Right? Like it's not just he's thrown into the world in a sense on the underside as a child of
Yeah.
Mary, but it's his death, like death cursed on a cross. And hashtag Leviticus.
Absolutely.
That
And there's a gendered actually thing that goes on with, because womanist theology does not maintain the cross at all. It's not as central at all. So you mostly see it with black male theologians, and it's getting actually. I'll tell you about Cone because he's pretty much the stalwart for this. He says, his response is that, look, I maintain the cross because every place I see suffering Christians, suffering poor suffering Christians, that's what they pick up, right? So it's something about God identifying with one suffering, right? That actually becomes the way of the central theological moment in which theology comes out of, right? So that we know God is everywhere. Some people talk about God in the beatific visions, or God in the sense of joy and ecstasy and that kind of thing. And they, write from that standpoint. Well, liberation theology writes from the pathos of God, right? That is the starting point for understanding theological reflection, right? God begins by talking about where the pain is, right? And that becomes the entry point or the sufferings of God in the world, which is interesting because you have, like, if you look at the whole story, right? The beginning of the Bible, you have the tree of life, right? The tree of life leads to this kind of inversion of the human cross, or it's kind of like this inversion of the tree of life that's happening. And then at the end, you get another kind of garden scene, right? That kind of reflects back to the tree of life. So you have these different historical moments. But what liberation theology emphasizes is the Good Friday moment, right? Where the world is on fire, right? And it's the idea that God stands with you in your most intense forms of suffering, right?
Mhm.
And that becomes the way of trying to think about the rest of Christian faith through that act, right? And Cone, use a kind of categorical scheme which privileges that mode of entry, that kind of path of transformation, where the path of Christianity is the stark confrontation of evil, right? That Jesus came to overcome evil, right? To confront evil, and and he does in a decisive way. But we keep we keep having to live in the context of that victory. So if you're talking about Black theology in terms of that, Black liberation theology, that's like the kind of paradigmatic way of understanding it, which contrasts many other different theological traditions. And Cone himself would say, look, I'm not the last word on this. I'm just
Right.
doing it for this particular community. There are many other valid ways of talking about theology. He wasn't imperialist in the way he tried to do that, but he was just trying to talk about if we look at the kind of story of a people and the pathos of God, right?
Mhm.
This is the way I understand God's activity functioning most visibly in the life of the oppressed.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, okay, we don't have a lot of time left, but there are a number of questions that came in uh surrounding the reading. Um so I so let me look. All right, here's one.
Mm-hmm.
Uh One of the critiques running through our reading was the relationship between theologies of glory and theologies of the cross.
Right.
Right. Um and you get it if you are theologically literate, right? But one of the groups reading it and doing this together uh in a small group from a church, uh the minister was like, I don't think my congregants will be picking up that part of what Cone's doing is reintroducing a theology of the cross to an
Yeah.
American white theology of glory. Uh,
Right,
could Adam
right.
make it more explicit?
Oh wow! I mean, you said it right there. I mean, well, I tried to say that by using the idea of Good Friday,
Mhm.
right? That he wants to say that Christianity has an Easter Sunday Jesus, and I'm trying to center Jesus on a Good Friday Jesus, right? Hopefully that metaphor, so that Good Friday, the world is on fire, it's burning, they're suffering. They want to go through the triumph, right? And want to bypass Good Friday to get to the resurrection. And Cone says, no, 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 you can't bypass this. This is important, right? And you can't understand the resurrection properly unless you go through the depth of that. And also Saturday, where God is actually dead, right? To go through the desolation and despair, to have the exhilaration of the Easter Sunday, you have to go through, you have to go through Friday and Saturday in order to
Mhm.
understand the exhilaration. They say Christianity just bypasses all the suffering and goes right to this kind of Kool-Aid Jesus, right? With this type of saccharine blood and just nice things.
Busting through the walls. like,
Yeah, exactly.
like
That it's
guy.
not real. And that's part of the abstraction, right? That it becomes this, and it becomes, and even Niebuhr critiqued this about the God of culture, right? He was talking about white middle bourgeois culture, right? Where all it does is reinforce your cultural norms, right? And Cohen wants to really separate that and really talk about that. No, in order to understand genuine Christian faith, that's not just an incidental part of the story. That's an essential. That's constitutive of. And to skip a step is to miss the significance, right? So that's where he's at with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Here's another one. Um, the the readings from Cross and the Lynching Tree are really hard to make sense if the only story of the gospel you've heard is one for the sinner and not the sinned against, or the
Mm,
violator and not the victim.
mm.
You start to retell the gospel in a way that addresses the victim and the violator, the sinner and the sinned against. What wisdom does Cone bring? I just want you to know I'm not taking responsibility for it essentially is a dissertation topic, but
Right, right. When I heard people ask Cone that question, he would always say, I'm curious why you asked that." Right? He would turn it back. He First of all, he would turn that back on the question. Whenever people ask Cone, like, does he forgive and all these other things, he would say, "Well, what made you ask that question before I respond to the question?" So the idea of having a Christianity that actually, you know, has the victim and the abuser, um, that it's almost like saying, look, if you say God is love, right? Love functions differently in different historical contexts, right? Like you don't have the batterer and the victim love the same way. The love for the batterer, right, is to stop battering. The love for the victim of the battery is to repair, right? So in that way, there's a different function, even though it might come out the same love. And love is not, when I use that word, I'm not using it as some type of personal, intimate thing. I'm talking about a will toward wholeness. Love becomes a
oh, that
will toward
that's
wholeness.
that's beautifully put. Will towards wholeness.
Yeah, yeah. That's what love means in that context. It's not an interpersonal situation.
Mm,
We confuse love with like a lot, or our personal feelings, right? So
yeah.
so when I use that terminology, I just want to be clear because it's had so much baggage with it.
Okay, so if we like take that distinction and then dig down, right, to um guilt, right, for things you've done wrong, and then shame for ways you've been harmed, degraded, and such. Like when it gets to the level of the individual, oftentimes people, wherever they are on the kind of analysis of structural power, have different parts of their life where they have been the victim and the violator. They have sinned and have been sinned against. They have shame for how they've been harmed, like uh domestic abuse, like you mentioned, or sexual assault in the home. Those kinds of things exist everywhere, and there's
Mm-hmm.
shame about it. And then there's the guilt on the other side. It's like when it comes to the individual, like most people, if they told the truth for an hour, will be uh will have guilt and shame that need dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
and when I wrestled with that concept in my last book, I used like Korean liberation theology and the concept of Han, right, to
Mm-hmm.
deal with it. Um and part of it's because I cut 2 chapters out of the dissertation. There was a chapter on Cone and Catherine Keller on Christ as paradox and Christ as parable. Cone paradox, Keller as parable. And
Mm-hmm.
but the but thinking about how guilt and shame, if you're phenomenologically for the individual, is something regardless of where you are in the structural hierarchy, everyone experiences both to different degrees, right? And then what does it mean to address those categories? Um, and and I say that, and looking at my outline of that chapter,
Yeah.
what one of the fascinating things about Cone is that that it's through uh the poetry in one chapter, thinking about the blues and all these kinds of things, that brings the fullness of life, that brings the complexity back in. It's through the self-testimony of people and the complexity and brokenness of our own lives that the amalgamation of guilt and shame that we all wrestle with shows up. And not in this book, but in what's the name of his autobiography?
Oh, you're talking about My Soul Looks Back? Or are you talking about
Yeah.
his new one? Yeah.
And there he made an observation that where he said that why is it something about like why is it that essentially white culture is always fascinated with black music? And he says because the black situation demands honesty about a wider spectrum of our experience.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah.
And
Interesting. That's
and I
interesting.
and
Yeah.
I love, like, to me that is one of those places where the paradox of the cross connected to how Catherine Keller does Christ as the parable, that problematizes the dynamic, but it's that spectrum of experience. I mean, do you have something to say about that? Because I I
Yeah.
love the question, but I really think like that there is a difference when thinking about the gospel towards like how it deals with guilt and then how it deals with something like shame or
Well,
harm.
when you first started saying that, I started thinking about Abraham Joshua Heschel, who said, "All are guilty, some are responsible." Few are responsible. So the idea that responsibility should be another category, the guilt and shame type thing. But in terms of really thinking about this, I mean, we also have the truth and reconciliation in South Africa. We don't, but we don't have enough rituals. I mean, around guilt and shame, right? So part of both, there should be some way, especially white churches maybe could lead this in the idea of repentance, right? There have been some anti-racist churches who try to talk about rituals of white repentance and what needs to be repented to. And, and repentance is a kind of inherent transformation, right? Like a turning of the heart away from the old ways of thinking and a renewed way of thinking about this, right? So that's about guilt, right? There's a way of trying to talk about repent. But shame is a different type of animal, right? Like, and it depends on what you're shamed for. Not, shame is not always debilitating. Sometimes you could be shamed because you didn't live up to your own standards, right? Like in terms of, like I'm just ashamed of myself. So it can be actually a motivating factor, right? But if you're talking about debilitating shame or imposed shame, right, that's a very different thing. But um, part of even the retreat into religion is to have another means to define oneself outside of those external structures of shame, right? So that's at least in the African American experience where religion has been so co-opted because the world has always tried to shame them. So it's a new concept of your humanity, right? By defining it by the internal pole, right? Instead of acquiescing to external categories, right? So to me, that's the very idea, the attraction of Christianity, right? Is a confrontation with oppression and shame.
Yeah. It, and one of the things that sticks out to me about that, or an important part of that question, is that so often once our macro identities and structures of power come up, we interpret the other that we don't see as our as one of our own on those terms. And often what animates angst, anger, like interpersonal, not structural, but like interpersonal anger, and frustration and all that kind of stuff comes from much more intimate acts of harm or shame and such. And I had not thought about this, but from a friend of mine who, I mean, he was part of the disciples of, he was one of the teachers at the Disciples of Christ anti-racism training when I was a like 20 something new minister, black minister, part of that training and such. And he had lots of cops in his congregation. And in one of the things he had noticed in doing anti-racism training, even with some of the local cops, is that when you knew the whole story, the story you're putting yourself often as a white cop of the person you're engaging in is this big macro system. But what you're actually showing up to are a domestic situation or a neighborhood situation, right? Like where the dynamics that you think you're showing up to on behalf of some authority isn't involved. And he would like give those examples to help them frame, and then go like and ask questions back to you, be it the minister is doing it or the cop when he facilitated it. And you realize that you can make observations about macro structural things, but then what's animating any individual in it can often be much more personal and intimate things. And if you inscribe any action into a big story, then you're actually alienating them from their own experience, whichever way the power structure goes. And and obviously, like, the thing you do with that is to think about how you do it, right? But I just remember being struck after that conversation, because I remember the first time I went overnight into a big city, right? And I was a middle schooler on a service trip, and then they're like, oh, we'll go get this from across the street. And I walked across the street in an urban environment. I'd not been in an urban environment much before. And all of a sudden I'm in an urban environment, and it's late at night. And then like literally every horrible thing I'd ever heard from any person in my family with all of its like racist baggage shows up about the third step out the door. And then like someone just tries to talk to me, and in my head I'm like, I'm inscribing you in a narrative of oh no, right? Like all that shows up. And in that conversation I realized that like one of the deadly parts, right, of white supremacy, of the way racism functions on both sides, is the way it gives us all narratives to put the other in. And it's ones where our own pain, struggle, and situation never rises to the fore.
Right. But the difference is, on the oppressed side, the narrative is defensive, right?
Exactly.
So there's a suspicion of white people. Yeah, there's a suspicion of white people, right? Because, not to say that every single white person, but because I have to actually protect myself. And I've seen too many people ruined by overly trusting, right? So, even though the narratives, there are this type of, most people say generalizations. You're generalizing, that type of thing, not taking people's individuality sufficiently into account. Yeah, but it's strategic generalizations, right? Like it's because I need to navigate a very hostile environment, not because I'm in a situation of privilege trying to exclude people from coming in, right? So I think the moral work is a little different from those type of perspectives.
No, I think that's important. I'm just always struck by how the situation changed, at least as a white guy, like how the situation changes when you think, I'm going to reflect on this and dig into it so that I'm less of a shit. It's the shift from like inherently being defensive. That's the hard part. After that, like, then it's learning to listen well and things like that enable you to take seriously other people's experience. But at least existentially, for me and a number of people I've talked, it's the getting past the the defense mechanism that you realize that is attached to some big power structure, and wanting to preserve something. And once you realize, okay, maybe this is just me, and I'm not saying I'm good at it, but like once you realize what you're defending is something that killed the one you call your Savior and Lord and doesn't lead to flourishing, then you need to cultivate more suspicion towards yourself than your neighbor.
Well, that's why Cohen always critiqued about your identity structure. That's why
Yeah.
to him it comes down to identity, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you don't have an identity in idolatry, right? That's why I call these type of things idols. It is very difficult for people caught up in these type of contemporary idols to change. It's not just a matter of will. It's not just a matter of intent. It's that your whole structure, your whole conditioning has been wedded to something that is death dealing for others, right? That's hard to see and hard to say sometimes. This is why you need to see from different vantage points. But, and I think this is why we have so much, in our contemporary moment, in the context of the United States, why you have such a wide backlash from white people, right? Because they see numerically things changing and they see the power structure getting to be more pluralistic. And they say, and the chant of white supremacists are, you will not replace us, right? You will not replace us, as if that's some type of intentional thing, right? So this is this to me speaks to what Cohn was writing in the 1960s and the 1970s, that how deadly that position is, and that when challenged, you'll see the whiteness is non-negotiable, right? They say, I don't think of myself as white as an American, but when you challenge that whiteness, you see it's a non-negotiable thing because people are willing to kill over that. They actually used to, and it becomes like an aggressive response. So for Cohn, it's both, you know, a structural and personal transformation. We can't minimize people's moral agency within that. What we have to recognize is more than personal moral agency. It has to be a reconstitution of our external structures. And then looking at alternative communities to identify with, such as Clarence Jordan's God movement, right? To try to say maybe that should center a new form of white identity instead of empire, right? So
Yeah.
communitarian ways of being.
Mm-hmm. I that's great. That's great. So okay, last question. Um and it's page 23 in there's observations Cone makes about black churches singing white hymns. And then how like just because his hymn was saying about, Jacob in a black church, it comes across differently than if you sing it in a white church. Right. And thinking, and it gives that beautiful description of how the figure Jacob plays out for the black church in America. And that runs up against a question that lingers in my mind. And this is something that came to, what do you do in churches where 90% of what was said in worship is the same as when they were slaveholders?
Wow, that's heavy.
That's
That's a heavy.
that's a real question. Thinking of my favorite hymns, some of them mentioned there, like I was like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. But I've preached at and gone to plenty of churches that they're the same buildings that were all white when slaveholders came in them. And the hymns that were sang were so similar. Plenty of the prayers are and stuff. And then if you put yourself in an environment, unless your white church is like inherently anti-racist, probably most of what is said in it is going to still pass muster. And I ask that question because like the impetus of crossing the lynching tree is to go like, there's something that you need to notice about a Christianity that's compatible with the slave. If it's a slaveholder's religion, something has to change. And it can't just be if the gospel matters to it, right? Things that happen outside the life of the church, at least explicitly. Worship should look and sound different, and that kind of thing. And if nothing changes in the liturgy apart from the, depending on how long the sermons are at your church, what occasionally gets signaled to, given how much leeway the minister has around politics, like, what do we do with that? Because if back in the day when we went 4 times a week, on Wednesdays after potluck was a hymn sing, and we all called out numbers. And I know which numbers got picked the most. And I know they were the same numbers that got picked in that congregation 200 years earlier. And
Wow.
And I wonder, what does it mean to keep handing off pious expressions of the faith that fit slaveholder Christianity if you don't want to indoctrinate your children into it?
Yeah, that's tough. I mean, that's an excellent question. Here's 2 responses. I mean, one, and you'll know this as like kind of a process person. Um, well, there's a desire for radical social transformation within Black theology, but there's an awareness that the past can never change, right? Um, there's a certain facticity to the past. So, on the one hand, in the immediate moment, and this might be a bit controversial, but the interpretation is more significant than the text, meaning that we have to train a group of radical interpreters, right? The book can say anything, it's just how we read the book, right? And if we have a proper liberative framing, right, then it doesn't matter whether it's the Constitution, the Bible, and any other document. We extract meaning in new ways, right? So part of it has to develop a series of intellectual abolitionists, right? To read the major documents of Western history in ways that are much more liberative, right? Because we're never going to actually, or it's going to take a long time to switch the authority of these documents, right? But in the meantime, we need to introduce other types of documents that could actually add into that, so that we're reading other texts as sacred scripture along with the Christian Bible, right? So when you say that, these are, I don't want to be overly academic with this, but many people, scholars of Christian origins and New Testament, will say, look, the interpretation, this text meant so many different things in different historical time periods. We look at the Pauline letters, it meant this thing in this community, it meant this thing in that community, that kind of thing. That we have to look at these texts and see the history of interpretation and find our own most liberative interpretation that's ready for the 21st century, right? That's one key. But in the meantime, we should also introduce more contemporary texts, right, that can actually speak to the common good, such as, for example, that when we talk about loving our neighbor, right, in one sense, you look at Hebrew scripture, the neighbor was the other Hebrew, right? So it was just tribal notion. Then you have the Good Samaritan idea, right, where it's the hostile other. Now we might want to talk about non-human neighbors. The environment's our neighbor, the cosmos is our neighbor, right? So it becomes this widening interpretive lens where you have the same scriptural mandate, loving one's neighbor, which is understood in one sense, like in maybe Exodus or some of the Pentateuch, as being your brother or sister tribesman. And in another sense becomes this way of understanding this almost pan-experientialism, right, where we live in a community of where we live in a community of subjects, right, instead of a community of objects, right. So we have this wider lens of interpretation. So I think that's where the training needs to go, where we need to think about things in ways that I'm related to your idea about scriptures, how it's read, the Jacob's ladder's read in Black churches and white churches in a different way, that we have to like train people to read these in the most liberative ways for their context, right? Because they're never will be identical, but we can have the same general framing where it's close,
Yeah. When you say that, I just think of how much nuancing I did from pulpits. Like, and I mean, I worked at a very large UCC church in Los Angeles. So this is not like the den of conservatism.
Hmm.
But when I wanted to make certain liberative exegetical points, I would make sure I nuanced it in ways, especially in the 9 o'clock service,
Hmm.
that they could get by some people that may not have
Yeah.
wanted to pick up on all the data and stuff. And I was getting really good responses. And then once I changed the prayer of repentance to include repenting for all the asthmatic children in Los Angeles because we live on a coast but drive across the city, and like real specific things that were connected to the same vision I was subtly preaching. Then I got the response, right? Uh, like you're telling me I should feel guilty because I live over here and drive over here for work. And I was like, you mean you drive by a bunch of poor areas where people have a large concentrated, not just humans living, but also children with asthma. And, I was like, and obviously I wasn't excluding myself. I drove 2 hours to Claremont back and forth twice a week. So like, I was just
Right.
being like, this is real, and
Being a
uh,
witness. Yeah.
yeah,
Forming
but
a different
but
witness.
I just say that because I remember being conscious. Like I don't write a lot of my sermons down, but those like paragraphs where I could get my ass fired.
Mm.
And then I'm
Yeah.
like, I know
Yeah.
what I wrote down. I'm going to read it because they're going to tell me what I said. And I want to be like, I'm just going to cut and paste what I said. And it was always nuancing. And I said, like when you were giving the challenge about like cultivating that hermeneutic, I like knew even let's say I had a mediocrely good version of that hermeneutic, I still was like, but I don't want to apply it explicitly when I'm preaching.
But that's why Jesus spoke in parables, right? Because he was
Yeah.
always in those dangerous situations where he could not say things directly, so he had to say them indirectly because he experienced, right, that similar type of persecution about, look,
Yeah.
are you gonna give this to Caesar, right, or give it to God, right? So what's more important? So I mean, that's, to me, that's the history of the tradition, right?
So,
And Jesus found a way to kind of say things without directly, say them. I mean, what Nathan Scott or James Scott calls this hidden script, right? He says there's one thing where you have a public resistance, but there's
yeah.
like backdoor type of resistance in the weapons of the weak, right? Are backdoor resistance where you'll see it in songs, you'll see it in work stoppages, you'll see it's not military, it's not economic power. That people who are marginalized have different ways of resisting and fighting, right? And Jesus
Yeah.
kind of fits the bill of that through his parables, his subversive parables of speaking that way. And I think we're in a moment where we might have to return to that.
Yeah. Okay. So I know you, you mentioned Clarence Jordan. His image of this is that Jesus told parables and it was like the Trojan horse.
Yeah,
They would
absolutely.
like you get asked a question, it's a tricky one, and then he like say tells a parable of Good Samaritan. Well, who's the neighbor? And they start to answer, and he goes, and Jesus left town, and right about an hour after he got out outside of town, they all realized he was talking shit about him. Like like it blows up then,
Right, right,
and
right, right, right.
it's so like he told them the truth, but he told it just slant enough that they had to wrestle with it long enough to realize they're implicated. And
Yeah,
the,
they didn't
the
have ears
Trojan
to hear,
horse.
right? I
Yeah.
mean, to me, that's any type of, when you're living under such hegemonic oppression, right? You have to you have to be strategic, right? I mean, so part of, like, discipleship is strategy, right? Being, you
Mm,
know, wise as a serpent, gentle as a dove, right? Like, in terms of that. So the wisdom of the serpent has to be, because certainly evil is very strategic, right? We didn't get in this situation by accident. So in order to actually overcome that, we have to be equally as strategic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. So this has been a lot of fun, and
Yeah, absolutely.
I hope that everyone listening enjoyed it as much as I did, and my questions and commentary didn't ruin Adam's brilliance, because it was pretty wonderful. Um, Next week we'll figure out exactly, what's going to go down at the Super Bowl.
Oh
Um,
yeah, that's right. Super
we got
Bowl. No,
I know
no,
we
it's not. It's 2 weeks away.
I know, but next week I feel like we should come up with a high quality bet, you know,
Oh, okay,
between the
okay.
representative of
That's right.
the
Cincinnati.
Rams and the
Reds. Okay,
Bengals. Like, I don't
right.
know what theologians, how they wager things when teaching classes online, but we're welcome to suggestions. But um the yeah, I'm really looking forward to next week we dig into womanist theology,
Mm.
um where uh and so this week actually they get to hear from is Roberts this week. Yeah.
Is it okay?
Yeah. Did,
Mm.
whoa. Did you hear something that just started pinging? Oh, that
That,
was intense.
yeah, that was. Sorry about that. That's my computer. Messages. I can't keep them off here.
Okay.
Yeah, I got
Yeah.
stuff in the background. It's like, oh gosh. Yeah.
Yeah. So this week, you'll get the email with the interview, uh, Robert Ellsberg, and it's a beautiful conversation about, as an editor of James Cone, you get tons of his personal flavor. Next week, we're looking at womanism. Andrea White joins, and then week
No.
6,
Special.
process and black theology hype. Yeah.
Yeah, you'll
So
like these. You'll like these. These are very interesting conversations, both of them. So I
yeah,
think you'll
mostly when I listen to him, I'm like, these are really, really good. He has not been doing this since 2008. Well, I should have gotten better.
Yeah, I remember Roberts. He was, he's a fascinating guy. Orbis Books, right? He's editor at Orbis Books, and not only does he did Cone, but he actually it's worth mentioning that he worked with Dorothy Day,
Mm-hmm.
right? He's part of the Dorothy Day House. He knows a lot about Thomas Merton, right? So he's worked with a lot of kind of American prophets in terms of that. His father was Daniel Ellsberg of the Pentagon Papers,
Yeah.
right? So he comes from a different lineage, and and is really a witness to history, progressive religious figure. So for him to kind of assess Cone and his relationship with Cone, I think you'll find very interesting,
Mm-hmm.
right? And also the dynamics of him being a white male editing, a black scholar's work, right? That took a level of trust, and he had developed the confidence of Cone in over years. It didn't come easily. So for him to talk about it, and he grew to be, pretty close to Cone. So it's
Yeah.
it's it's going to be I think you'll get a lot out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So pay attention. Pay attention to that.
All right. We'll see you on next week, same time.
Same time,
And
same channel.
oh yeah.
Facebook, YouTube. Oh man.
All right. That was
Yeah,
fun.
I hope that background didn't. Oh man, I was trying to get people to be quiet. It's just as the
You
night gets older, it just things get
you don't
louder.
have to explain it to me. We're
Okay,
recording when all mine went to bed.
gotcha.
I've tried when they're
Yeah,
awake.
yeah. It's
Uh,
like I'm trying not to be rude, but it's like, come on now, I'm taping.
well, once I'm back in the States, then I can just talk to you after our children are asleep. And then
Right, right. What time do your
yeah.
kids go to bed?
Well, the little ones go to bed at like 8 or 8:30. Elgin, he stays up, but I mean, he reads until late, but he's like in bed at like 9:30.
Mm.
That's why I always like I record and do these classes at 10 my time, because that is when I can be pretty confident I'm not on parent duty, unless there's like a problem significant enough to you know, require me to like say, hey, we should reschedule.
Mm.
But
Gotcha. Gotcha.
on live
Gotcha.
stream days, then Alicia knows that if something happens, she's in charge. But
Right. Right.
if it's just
Gotcha.
recording interviews, I can always reschedule if things switch up. But
Gotcha. Gotcha.
the I emailed you with questions about what you want on the podcast thing that shows up in iTunes.
Oh yeah. 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 Just boy, things have been just. Yeah. No, I saw it. I just haven't had a chance to respond. I've been just
Oh
too
no, I was
much.
just making sure. I was just making sure you saw it, and for the and then we should record what, or you can record and send me whatever you want for the intros.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. God, I got so
Uh,
much to do. Just good.
well, I mean, one thing I mean, I can always make, if you told me what you needed to say in it before it started, I can record short ones and just be like, blah, 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 and say whatever you need said
No,
in it.
I'll do. It just slipped my mind. I'm glad you mentioned it because I just haven't been with it in a long time. It's just that I got 3 classes and it's just
I,
yeah, too
I
lot.
understand the situation. That's why I was reminding you. And
Yeah, no, I'm glad you did. 'Cause
if
I
you don't
told
want a lot in it, if it's just like, this is from this, blah, 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 go here,
no,
then
I'll put it up because they did ask. Actually, they contacted me again today. They just every week it's like something else. Um, yeah, yeah, I got it.